Hello, this is the video for week 2 for discussing our thesis topic. I apologize if I sound congested or if it's difficult to hear me. If there's any questions or concerns, just let me know. I'll try to clarify or make a new video or whatever. But this is also just in preparation for what we're planning on doing. And what I'm planning on doing is looking toward NHL agreements with other countries, or what other countries have between each other for transferring players. And the reason that I was saying about this topic is because I did some research on an Eastern Asian hockey league, but there's only so many teams. But lately, NHL clubs are starting to look toward players from these regions to try to draft them or sign them. And what happens is that these players then leave from a very thin player pool internationally from their countries, and the teams become weaker for international play. There's less competition in their location, and the leagues end up falling apart. The teams end up going bankrupt. And we're seeing the same issue, not just for these little leagues. I don't mean children's little leagues. I mean, I guess I should say smaller leagues, and even the larger leagues like the KHL, where players are drafted and they choose not to sign over typically money-related issues. And then, of course, you have KHL clubs that don't want their players to go, because if all their young talent goes, then they don't have any young talent to keep their league going. And because the Russian economy is not doing so well, a lot of the teams are collapsing anyway, and players can't be paid. So you have this very delicate balance between, well, we need to pay our players a lot of money so they can stay, and we can't afford to pay these players, and then the players are leaving because they're not being paid, and they're going back to the NHL or to other places. And what's holding up a lot of the issues, especially with the KHL, are transfer agreements. And other leagues also have transfer agreements with the NHL. They usually stipulate how much money a club will get in return for a drafted player depending on when they're signed. Because the name of the game is always going to be retaining as much talent as possible or getting the most amount of money for them. That way your club assures financial stability, and so does the league. And the KHL has been refusing these agreements because they just want so much money, or they don't want the players to leave at all until they're in their late 20s. So when you're dealing with these leagues that are much smaller, they have a very weak international pool of players, you start wondering, like, not only how can they possibly compete against the NHL and European players internationally, but how can they even afford to lose players to places like the NHL? What happens is you're starting to see the shift of players from these Eastern Asian leagues being drafted or signed, and they're not getting anything back for them. So the NHL is basically just taking the players out. So that's going to be what I'm looking at for part number 1, is where the NHL looks for players and try to expand into this region of what players are being looked at, and how the NHL is taking them out, which is, as I said, either by being drafted or signed. And there's also another added wrinkle too when you're dealing with Canadian minor league teams like the OHL. They also have international spots, so it's possible a player could be taken with the international spot and then drafted by the NHL. So there's several different ways that these players are basically taken out of their hometowns and are going into the NHL or into Canada or the US. And part 2, which is I think going to be the bulk of it, would be coming up with a transfer agreement that works for the NHL and this other league, the Asian Hockey League. Now, what I wanted to do was I wanted to look at current transfer agreements. I haven't been able to find anything yet. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means I haven't found a set rules like 101A, 101B, 102A, blah, 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 blah. That kind of stuff, where it's actually completely written out. I have found a lot of websites that discussed about it, that talked about money and ages, but I haven't found any actual written guidelines yet. And I have found something on the International Hockey Federation where they talk about between different European leagues, but I didn't really have a chance to go into it yet. So what I wanted to do was I even emailed the NHL and I haven't heard anything back. So I'm going to try again. I want to see if the NHL has written transfer agreements, and I also emailed the International Ice Hockey Federation and I haven't heard back about transfer agreements. But those are going to be really the two big sources, because I want to see what they already have done. I want to see what their model look like, and I want to see what the international ones look like too, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel, but you still need to make sure that you really need to create or find a similar kind of agreement and then modify it for that need. Because even though you're dealing with a very large population in many different countries, they're all part of that surrounding area in these leagues, the economic developments and the player pool themselves are completely different than Northern European countries and Russia, where the transfer agreements might work for them, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for this particular market, especially a much weaker market internationally and player pool wise. So just to kind of reiterate, it's going to be one, examining drafting and taking players from these smaller leagues, and two, working on a transfer agreement that will make sure that these leagues and teams are properly giving compensation for the players taken or either drafted or signed. And I think part of it's also going to be based on a tier system on age, and making sure that not all these players are just swept up without any kind of compensation immediately, but as soon as they turn 18 they're eligible for drafting, because it seems like a lot of transfer agreements don't really they allow for it, but they also have a heavier and compensation for doing so. So if anyone has any good ideas or know where to look, I'm still trying to get some actual written guidelines, and I'm going to go from there to see if I can find anything else, or if it turns into something else. So I hope everyone is having a great day, and any questions or comments will be greatly appreciated. Thank you.